"All right," I said, which was a ridiculous thing to say because it did not speak my language and I did not speak its language, but I said it the way you say something to fill the air when air needs filling. I went to the cauldron and ladled a small bowl of the hot grain water, not the porridge yet, just the cooking water, barely flavored, and set it on the floor in front of it. It did not move for a long moment. Then it lowered its head and drank, fast, like something that needs water more than it needs composure. I went back to work. I kept my body between the tent entrance and the child, which was not a decision I made consciously, and is the kind of thing I prefer not to analyze too closely. At 6:15, before the pre-service setup, before I opened the tent flaps, someone was at the entrance. Not a regular, not a supply clerk. I knew by the sound, or rather, by the absence of the particular sounds that mean a person approaching normally, the footstep and canvas brush and casual weight of someone coming in out of habit. This was a different weight. This was something that approached slowly and stopped outside and did not immediately come in, and the quality of its pause was not uncertainty but deliberation. I opened the tent flap. There were 7 of them. I have tried to find adequate language for this in the year since it happened, and I have not found it. I will try again now and settle for the best approximation I can offer. They were enormous. The largest, the one at the center of the group, fractionally ahead of the others, was perhaps 3 meters at the shoulder, scaled in slate gray with bronze along the ridge plates of the back and the full length of the tail, a coloring so dark and so old that the bronze looked not added but revealed, as if the gray were a patina and the bronze the metal beneath. Her face, I use her, because I learned later, but I could not have told you then, was long and angular and ancient in the way that very old things are ancient, not merely worn but settled. Every line had decided where it was going to be and had been there for long enough that the decision was invisible. Her eyes were the color of deep amber, not the clear amber gold of Kettle's young eyes, but amber darkened by time, by depth, by the specific gravity of something that has seen a very great deal. Behind her, 6 others, somewhat smaller, ranging in color from dark charcoal to a deep oxidized copper that was, I registered in some distant part of my mind, quite close to the color of the child under my table. They were all looking at me. I did not step back. I want to be clear about that, not because it was brave, but because stepping back did not occur to me. I have been standing at tent entrances for 11 years in the face of complaints about insufficient portions, supply shortages, heating failures, and the innumerable small indignities that a transit camp inflicts on people who are already exhausted. And the instinct that has served me in all of those situations is to stand still and wait for the other party to say what they have come to say. I waited. The large one, the old one, the ancient one, the slate and bronze one lowered her head slightly. Not a bow. Something more deliberate than a bow, more controlled. A positioning as if she were calibrating the distance between her eye and mine to something precise. She spoke. The language was not one I knew. It was not the 3-syllable questioning sound that Kettle had made on the first evening. It was a different register entirely, lower, resonant in a way that I felt in my sternum rather than heard with my ears alone. A complex sound, the kind of sound that carries weight in the way that formal address carries weight, not conversational, not questioning, but declarative. I did not understand a word of it. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't have a translation unit. There's one at the processing desk on the north side of camp if you need," and then I stopped because the old one had moved. She had moved past me, into the tent. I turned. She was walking the length of the tent in that slow, calibrated way, her head low, reading the space by smell as much as by sight. The others had come in behind her, fanning out slightly, not crowding but present. I felt the tent canvas shift with their collective weight. I was aware, with a clarity that was not quite alarm but was adjacent to it, that 7 large draconic bodies in a tent designed for a serving line, and perhaps 40 standing human-sized guests was a situation that had a number of possible developments, and that I had very little leverage over which one occurred. The old one had reached the serving table. She stopped, she lowered her head further, she looked under the table. I watched Kettle look back. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 10, time moved oddly in that tent. No one made a sound. The child on the grain sacks was pressed flat, wings down, in a posture I had not seen before, tail wrapped tight, eyes on the ancient face above it. The ancient face was utterly still. Then Kettle made a sound. Not the questioning 3-syllable sound of the first evening, not the small quiet sounds it made when it was settled in content. A different sound, layered, complex, with a tremor in it that I recognized without needing the language, because it was the sound of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and has just found the thing they were frightened without. The Ancient One replied, low, short, a single phrase. The child came out from under the table. It moved to the Ancient One's foreleg, the near one, the left, and pressed its copper-brown head against the scaled shin. The Ancient One's head came down close, so that the long, angular jaw rested for a moment along the child's spine, along the stub wings, with a slowness and deliberateness that was not caress precisely, but was the same family of gesture, the kind of touch that says, I have you, you are here, the searching is done. I stood by the serving counter and did not say anything. After some time, the old one raised her head. She looked at me. Not the calibrating look from the entrance, something else. She looked at me the way you look at something you are trying to understand fully, from all of its angles, without the benefit of a common language or a shared frame, the way you look when you are doing the work of comprehension by attention alone. It is a slow look. It is uncomfortable to be the subject of it. I held still. I have a lot of practice holding still. One of the 6 behind her moved forward, smaller, the dark oxidized copper, young by comparison to the ancient, though young is a relative term when you are looking at something that was already old before any living member of my species was born. This one's eyes were a paler amber than the ancient's. It stood at the Ancient One's shoulder and looked at me, and then it spoke. In my language. Not fluently. There was an architecture to the sentences that was clearly translated through a second mental grammar, each phrase arriving slightly more formal than native speech would make it. But my language, unmistakably. She asks, the younger one said, who kept her grandchild. I considered the question. I run the mess hall, I said. It was under my table, I fed it. The younger one translated. The Ancient One listened. A pause. Then the younger one again. She asks for how many days? 7, 8 counting today. Another translation. A longer pause this time, in which the Ancient One was very still, and her amber eyes did not leave my face. She asks, did you know whose child it was? No, I said. It didn't have any identification on it. The younger one translated. Something happened in the group. A shift, a change in the quality of their collective stillness, the way a room changes when something unexpected is said. I could not read it. I did not try to. She asks, why did you feed it if you did not know whose it was? I thought about how to answer that. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the honest answer is the kind of answer that sounds insufficient when you say it out loud. And I have learned, at 61, that insufficient-sounding answers are often the only true ones available. It was hungry, I said, and I had food. The younger one translated. The Ancient One was still for a long time. Then she did something I was not prepared for. She lowered her head, the full, long, angular head, the slate-gray and bronze ancient face, not to the calibrating position she had used at the entrance, not the distance-setting positioning of first contact, but down fully, until the broad ridge of her jaw was at the level of my chest, until I could have put my hand on the back of her neck if I had reached out. I did not reach out. That was not the moment for it. She held that position for the count of perhaps 8 slow breaths. Then she raised her head, and the amber eyes were different, not warmer. That is not the right word, because warmth implies something that was cold before, and she had never seemed cold but resolved, as if the thing she had been computing had returned a value. She spoke at some length. The younger one listened, and then translated. Her name is Dresh Korath. She is sovereign of the Vethara pack. The child's name is, and here the younger one paused, produced a syllable in the draconic language that sat in no alphabet I knew, and then said, "There is no exact translation. The nearest equivalent in your language would be something like, the one who is learning the shape of things. She has been called this since her hatching. It is a name that expects time." I looked at the child. The child was still pressed against Dresh Korath's leg, watching me with those honey-gold eyes. "I called her Kettle," I said. "In my own head, I didn't use it to her face." The younger one translated. Something happened in the quality of the Ancient One's stillness that was, I think, amusement, though I have no certainty about that because I am not in the habit of reading the emotional register of beings 3 times my height, who have been alive for longer than my civilization has maintained written records. Dresh Korath says, the younger one continued, that the child found you on the 2nd night. Not the first evening when you set the bowl down, that was survival, but the 2nd night when she came back before the line before the sun was up. That was choice. She says the child did not come back to the bowl, she came back to you. I did not say anything. I was aware that there was something in my chest that was threatening to behave in a way I would find embarrassing, and I was concentrating on not letting it. Dresh Korath says, "The Vethara do not forget a debt." "It wasn't a debt," I said. "I just fed her anyone would have." The younger one looked at me for a moment before translating. After the translation, the Ancient One was quiet for what felt like a long time. Dresh Korath says, "No, not anyone. She had been in the camp for 6 days before she came under your table, 6 days. Many people saw her. You are the first who put food on the floor." That sat in the air of the tent for a moment. I thought about that, about 6 days of a small copper-scaled child moving through a camp of 63,000, visible and hungry and frightened and unseen. I thought about the gray thorn tree shapes at the perimeter on Thursday evening, and understood then that they had been there longer than Thursday. That the sovereign of the Vethara pack had been at the tree line, circling, searching, unable to come into the camp because of, I didn't know the reason, some protocol, some complication of camp law or interspecies diplomatic constraint that I was not privy to and would not have understood if I had been. While her grandchild moved through 63,000 people and asked, in a language none of them spoke, to be fed. "How long were you at the perimeter?" I asked. The younger one translated. 4 days, it said back. I put my hand on the counter to have something to hold on to. 4 days, I said. The camp protocols for draconic sovereign approach require a 48-hour notification and a coordinated intake. Dresh Korath filed the notification. The camp administration acknowledged it, but the coordination process takes time, I said. Yes, I know how that works. The younger one was quiet for a moment. She knew the child was in the camp. She could, a pause, a word chosen carefully, she could tell. At a distance, she knew the child was alive and was frightened, and then on the 3rd day was less frightened. She did not know why. She has been waiting to know why. Now I understood the look she had given me from the entrance. Not alarm assessment, not territory reading. That had been the look of a sovereign who had spent 4 days at a fence line, knowing her grandchild was inside and afraid and unable to reach her, and who had finally walked through the gate and found her grandchild under a serving table, full-fed and calm, sleeping in a folded apron, beside a woman with gray-streaked hair who had simply done what the situation required. I looked at Kettle, at the one who is learning the shape of things, and she was looking at me with those honey-gold eyes, and her tail had begun the slow side-to-side sweep that I had noticed around the 5th day, and learned to associate with contentment. I looked at Dresh. "She's all right," I said. "She ate well, she slept warm. She knows where the pilot burner is, so you'll want to watch for that." The younger one translated. The ancient one made a sound, low, brief, the first sound she had made since the long, formal phrase at the beginning that I had not understood. And this sound I did not need translated because it was the sound of a weight setting down. What happened next took a long time, and I will compress it, because it is the kind of time that is important to have lived through, but loses something in the telling if you detail it too closely. 2 of the 6, at a direction from Dresh, left the tent and returned with a camp coordinator, a young woman named Briva, duty coordinator for the morning shift, who arrived at the door of Mess Hall C to find 7 large draconic bodies arranged in the space around the serving counter, and a 61-year-old kitchen worker standing at her cauldron watching them, and who handled it with the particular professional equanimity of someone who has been working at Tethara, crossing long enough to have stopped being surprised by things. Briva had a translation unit. Briva's translation unit, unlike mine, was rated for high-complexity draconic languages and had a half-second processing lag. The conversation that followed was long and multilateral, and much of it was about procedures I was not involved in, the formal documentation of Kettle's time in the camp, the repatriation process, some discussion between Dresh and Briva about the notification delay and the intake protocol that had attention to it I was not positioned to resolve, and did not try to. I stood at my counter. At some point, without quite deciding to, I started the morning line setup, because it was 6:45 and the line opened at 6:30, and I was already 15 minutes late, and the people waiting outside in the plateau wind were waiting because they needed breakfast, and none of the conversations happening inside my tent were going to feed them. I opened the tent flap and started serving. The line did not react to the 7 large draconic bodies arranged along the south wall of the tent with any more than the mild, sideways curiosity that characterizes people who have learned to take the world as it presents itself. A few of the children stared. One of the Varethi traders, an older male with sun-worn amber scales who came through my line 3 times a week, glanced at Dresh, registered her coloring and her bearing, and lowered his head for a moment in a gesture I did not know the meaning of, but which Dresh acknowledged with a slight inclination of her own. Kettle came and sat beside my left foot. She stayed there through the morning line, the same as the past 5 days. She watched the faces coming through. When a human child tried to press its face against the counter edge to see her, I leaned over and said, "Back in line, please," in the same tone I always used, and the human child went back, and Kettle's tail did the slow side-to-side sweep. Dresh watched all of this from the south wall. At the end of the morning line, when the last tin bowl had gone and I was beginning the between-service cleanup, Briva came over and told me, in the quiet, practical way she had, that the formal repatriation documentation was complete, and that the Vethara pack would be departing the camp with the child by early afternoon, and that there was, additionally, a matter that Dresh wished to address. "What matter?" I said. "She'd like to speak to you directly," Briva said, "with me translating. If you're willing." I set down the long-handled brush. "All right." We went to the south wall. Dresh was seated, which, for a creature of her size, meant that her head was still well above mine, but it was a different posture than standing, less formal, more considered. Kettle was against her foreleg again, copper-brown head tilted, watching me with the expectant attention she had given the morning line. Briva translated. What Dresh said, through Briva's careful half-second lagged precision, was this: "The Vethara pack does not forget debts." She had said this already, through the younger one, but she had more to say about it now, and the fuller version was this: "The Vethara do not forget, but they are also not foolish." They know the difference between a person who does something because they know it will be repaid and a person who does something because the situation is in front of them and doing nothing is not in their nature. The first kind of debt is a transaction. The second kind is a different thing without a word in my language exactly, though Briva attempted several. Recognition, perhaps. Witnessing. The acknowledgement of a character. Dreshkoreth was here to perform the second kind. She said, the child's name, the one who is learning the shape of things, would now carry an additional designation, which in the Vethara naming convention is added when a hatchling's early life has been shaped by something outside the pack. The designation was not something Briva could fully render in my language without losing something, but the nearest version was, she who was kept. In reference to no specific keeper, Briva clarified. The designation referred to the act, not the actor, to the being kept as a condition. The child would carry it because she had been kept fed, sheltered, held in routine, during the 8 days she was lost, and that keeping had shaped her. It would be in her formal name for the rest of her life. I stood with my hands at my sides and listened to this. Dreshkoreth said, in the Vethara tradition, when a designation of this kind is given, it is customary to inform the one whose act gave rise to it. The act itself is already recorded. It is already part of the child's name, already woven into the pack's record. But the informing is also part of the tradition, because to act without knowing the weight of what you did is one kind of thing, and to know is another kind, and the Vethara hold that both kinds have value and that the second is not diminished by the first. She said, I would like you to know the weight of what you did. I said, I ladled soup into a tin bowl and set it on the floor. Briva translated. Dreshkoreth was quiet. Then she said through Briva, yes, and the child came back. Because the bowl was set on the floor, and not handed over the counter in the way that means charity, and not pushed in the child's direction in the way that means go away, and not offered with a look that means what are you, but put quietly on the floor in reach. The manner of the bowl matters. The child knew it. She has been in 4 other refugee camps in her life, having traveled with the pack on trade routes since she was small, and she knows the difference. I thought about that for a while. She's very young, I said, to know that difference. Briva translated. Dreshkoreth looked at me with those deep amber eyes. She is young, Briva rendered, but the Vethara travel early. She has been in enough lines to know who sets the bowl down. I did not say anything after that for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and because I was, privately, dealing with the thing in my chest that had been threatening to misbehave since the child came out from under the table and pressed itself against its grandmother's leg, and it was now behaving in the way I had been trying to prevent. I am 61 years old. I have been setting bowls on floors and counters for 11 years at Tethara Crossing. I had not, until that morning, considered the manner of the bowl as a thing worth considering. It was simply the bowl. It was simply the floor. The manner was whatever the moment made it. But I thought about what she said. I thought about 6 days in the camp, 63,000 people, a small copper creature asking in a language no one spoke. I thought about the grain sacks and the folded apron and the pilot burner and the schedule, 7 minutes before the line, learned without a word. I thought about the shapes at the tree line on Thursday evening that I had told myself were graythorn trees. I thought about 4 days at the fence, knowing and unable to reach. I thought about what it means to be known by the manner of a bowl. I had worked 30 years in institutional kitchens before Tethara Crossing hospital canteens, school lunch programs, the community feeding program on the edge of the city where I grew up, which ran out of a repurposed garage and fed 400 people a day, and which I joined when I was 28 and left when I was 43, and which I still think about more than I think about most other things. In all of that time, in all of those lines, I had never thought of the bowl as a communication. It was a delivery. The food was the thing, the bowl was a container. But I thought about Dreshkoreth's words through Briva's careful translation. The bowl was set on the floor, and not handed over the counter in the way that means charity, and not pushed in the child's direction in the way that means go away. And I understood that I had been communicating all along, without knowing it, through 30 years of lines and bowls and floors. That every person who had ever stood in front of me in a queue had read the manner of the bowl and drawn from it some conclusion about what they were to the person holding the ladle, and that most of them had drawn the right conclusion, because that is what the manner of the bowl communicates, and that I had been doing this without ever having been told it was a thing I was doing. I am not given to sentiment about my work, but I felt something that morning, standing at the south wall of Mess Hall C with 7 large draconic bodies watching me, and a child with honey-gold eyes doing the slow contentment sweep with her tail, that was close enough to sentiment that I kept my face very still until it settled. I looked at Kettle, she who was kept, she who was learning the shape of things, and she was looking back at me with her honey-gold eyes, and her tail was doing the slow sweep, and there was something in her face that I did not have the language for and still don't, but that I recognized the way you recognize things that don't require language. "Thank you," I said, to Dresh Korath, to Briva, who had translated with patient precision, to the tent, perhaps, and to the specific morning light coming through the canvas at the angle it comes through in late autumn, warm but thin, the kind of light that suggests the day will be good and brief. Dresh Korath inclined her head. Then she spoke again, and Briva translated, and what she said was, "If you are ever in need of passage or protection or simply of being in a place where you are known, find the Vethara. Give your name. They will know it." I said, "I'll remember." She said, "Well, make sure you don't need to rely on your memory." The formal repatriation was completed by early afternoon, as Briva had said it would be. Paperwork such as it was the camp's documentation system for interspecies minors, which is extensive and which I was not required to participate in beyond confirming the dates of the child's presence in my tent, which I did in the administrative office in the North Block, standing at a counter while a form filler entered the details. 8 days. Meals provided, breakfast and dinner daily. Condition at time of discovery, distressed, hungry, ambulatory. Condition at time of repatriation, well-nourished, calm. That was all they needed from me, and I gave it to them, and I went back to Mess Hall C to start the dinner setup. The tent felt larger without them. This is a statement about perception, not about actual space. The tent is the tent. It doesn't change. But the south wall, without 7 large draconic bodies arranged along it, had a particular quality of ordinary that felt, that afternoon, slightly loud. I set up the cauldron. I ran the line at 5:30. I did the cleanup. I folded the apron. The grain sacks under the table were still there. I left them. That night, walking the composting route on the east side, I stopped at the fence and looked toward the tree line. It was empty. Just the gray thorn trees and the plateau wind and the particular mineral smell of the scrubland. I stood there for a while anyway, not for any reason. Just stood, in the way you stand in places that have held something after the something has moved on. Then I went back inside and did the morning prep and went to bed. The camp's paper, the weekly transit newsletter that the administrative office produces on a recycled fiber single sheet and posts to the board beside the processing desk, ran a brief item the following week. I did not write it, and I would not have, and it was not accurate in all of its particulars. It said that a camp worker had sheltered the lost grandchild of the Vethara sovereign for over a week, and that the sovereign herself had come in person to retrieve the child and had spent the morning in the camp's mess hall. It said the worker had been formally recognized by the Vethara pack. It did not say what that recognition looked like, because the person who wrote the item had not been in the tent and was working from Briva's intake report, which was accurate about the facts and silent about the specifics, which is the appropriate register for an intake report. I read the item twice. I folded the newsletter and put it in the canvas pocket of my apron and went back to the morning line. People ask me about it. Not many, and not for long. Tethara Crossing has 63,000 residents and a news cycle measured in days, not weeks. But for a week or two, there were people in the line who had read the newsletter item and who said things. Most of it was well-meaning. Some of it was the kind of thing people say when they are impressed by something and have not had time to think clearly about what they are impressed by. "You must have been terrified" was a common one. "You're so brave. How did you know it was safe?" I did not know what to do with these, so I mostly did not engage with them. I set bowls on the counter. I moved the line along. A few times when someone pressed, I said, "It was hungry. I had food." The logic was not complicated, and then I moved the line along. The answer that I could not give, in the 30 seconds of a soup line, was the longer one. The one about the manner of the bowl and what Dresh Korath said about it. The one about 6 days in a camp of 63,000 and 4 days at a fence line. The one about a small copper-scaled creature learning a schedule in 3 days, arriving 7 minutes early, not to the bowl but to me, to the shape of me, the routine of me, the particular quality of the morning before the line begins. That answer takes longer than 30 seconds, and it is also not mine entirely to give, because it belongs partly to a child whose name means the one who is learning the shape of things, and who is somewhere out there with the Vethara pack, still learning. I think about her sometimes, not with any weight of feeling I could not carry, more the way you think about a particular stretch of work that went well, with a quiet satisfaction that doesn't need words and doesn't ask for them. The folded apron is still there on top of the grain sacks where it always was. I do not use it for a kneeling pad anymore. I use a different grain sack for that, one from the newer stack. This one I keep folded. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that a transit camp accumulates over the years, one more in the pattern, barely visible in the overall cloth, but it is there, and I know where it is, and that is enough. I set up the cauldron, I run the line, I fold the apron. Every morning, every evening, the ladle and the pot and the bowl and the next in line. That is the shape of my day, and I have learned in 61 years not to underestimate the shape of a day. The first thing you have to understand about Tethara Crossing is that nobody there is supposed to stay. It says so on the processing boards at the entrance gate, in 7 languages and 2 pictographic registers. Transit facility, temporary accommodation, maximum authorized stay 90 days. The boards have been there since the camp opened, 14 years ago. They are sun-bleached now, the lettering faded on the side that catches the afternoon wind off the plateau, and they mean roughly what any sign means in a place that has been temporary for 14 years, which is to say, not much. You see the same faces in my line every morning. You learn the order people take their bowls. You know who likes the broth thin, and who will push the ladle back at you if the portion doesn't reach the second mark on the tin. I have been running the breakfast and dinner line at Mess Hall C for 11 years. Before me, it was a woman named Tessek, who died of a cardiac event in the cold water at the camp's eastern standpipe one February morning, and before her, it was someone whose name I never learned, because Tessek only told me the job and not the history when I took over her apron. The apron is brown canvas with 2 front pockets wide enough to hold a ladle handle and a rag. It has been washed so many times that the strings are soft as old bandaging, and it sits on my hips with the weight of something that belongs there. I am 61 years old. My husband died 7 years before I came to Tethara Crossing, and my children are grown and on a different continent, and we talk every few months in the way that people do when the distance is not hostile but simply very large. I am not lonely in the way that people assume when they hear those facts. I am busy, which is different. The morning line at Mess Hall C opens at 6:30, and I have had the cauldrons on since 4. And between 4 and 6:30, there is no room in my head for anything except whether the second burner's pilot is catching clean, and whether the day's grain allotment has actually arrived at the supply gate, or whether I will need to go and argue for it again, which I have done 37 times in 11 years, and which I always win. Because the supply clerks have learned that I am more patient than they are, and will simply stand at the gate until the requisition is filled. That is the shape of my life at Tethara Crossing. Ladle, pot, tin bowl next in line. It was raining the evening I found the child. Not the hard rain that comes off the plateau in autumn and drives people into the canvas corridors between the tent rows, but a steady, soft, gray curtain rain that smells of dust and wet canvas, and the particular mineral scent of the scrubland beyond the perimeter fence. It had been raining since midday. The dinner line was slower than usual because the western approach path floods in that kind of rain, and half my regulars had gone around the long way. I had already put away the second cauldron, lentils and root broth with dried herb, the same as 4 nights in every 7, and I was scrubbing the serving counter with the long-handled brush and thinking about nothing in particular when I heard it. It was a very small sound, not a word, not quite a cry. Something between the two, a high, thin, wet sound that had been going on for some time before I noticed it. The way a drip from a loose fitting becomes part of the background until you stop and listen and realize it has been there for an hour. I stopped, I listened. It was coming from under the serving table. I should explain the serving table. It is a long trestle of folded steel that I put up every meal and fold back along the tent wall afterward. It is low slung. The legs are adjustable, and I keep it at counter height for serving. But underneath there is a gap of about 60 centimeters between the table's lower shelf and the packed dirt floor, and I keep 3 empty grain sacks down there for the times when I need to kneel on the ground to relight the pilot burner. The sacks are doubled over and laid flat, and they make a sort of rough pallet against the tent's south wall, which is the warmest wall because it catches the afternoon heat from the plateau before it dissipates. Something was lying on the grain sacks. I got down on one knee. The light inside the tent was the low amber of the electric lanterns we run off the camp's generator, not bright, but enough. I looked under the table. It was a dragon child, a very small one. I knew what I was looking at. You cannot work at Tethara Crossing for 11 years and not know the shapes of the peoples who come through. I had seen draconic folk before, the Varethi trade families who pass through in groups every spring, with their iridescent amber-green scales and their folded wings held flat against their backs in the submissive travel posture. The old Kethori solitary, Pell, who had been in the camp longer than I had, and who sat every morning at the end of the line and ate in silence, and whose ridged, dark gray crest I could identify from across the tent. I knew the shapes. This was not any of those shapes. This was something I had not seen before, which was its own information. The child was small, no bigger than a camp dog, maybe 40 centimeters at the shoulder if it had been standing, which it was not. It was lying on its side on the doubled grain sacks with its knees drawn up and its stub wings, barely more than ridged flaps of skin, still the soft translucent copper of a very young creature pressed flat against its back. Its scales were a dark coppery brown on the back and sides and paler, almost amber, along the belly and the inside of its stubby forearms. Its snout was blunt and short, not elongated the way adult draconic faces tend to be, and its eyes, the one visible eye, the one not pressed against the grain sack, were the deep liquid gold of honey held up to a lamp. It was looking at me. It had been crying. That was the sound I'd heard. The scales around its eye were darkened with moisture in the way that scaled creatures darken when they've been wet for a long time, and there was a trembling in its small barrel chest that was not quite breathing. The hiccuping, irregular catch of something that has been crying and has exhausted itself and is not quite done. We looked at each other for a moment. Then it said something, very quietly, in a language I did not speak, 3 syllables, rising at the end, the universal shape of a question. And I did not need to speak the language to understand that it was asking something simple, because there is a particular quality to the sound a creature makes when it is asking for the most basic thing it needs. I have heard it in human children and in camp dogs, and in the small yellow lizards that nest in the supply tents' eaves and cry for their mothers in the spring. I stood up. I went to the cauldron. I ladled the last of the lentil broth into a tin bowl, a proper bowl, not a cup, and I set it on the floor and pushed it gently under the table until it was within the child's reach. Then I went back to scrubbing the counter. I heard it move. I heard the small click of claws on packed dirt, and then the soft ceramic sound of a snout against tin, and then nothing for a while except the rain on the canvas and the distant generator hum. I did not look. Looking would have meant something, an acknowledgement of the strangeness of the situation, an invitation to address it, and I did not have the energy that evening for strangeness. I had been on my feet since 4 in the morning, and my back was telling me so. When I looked again 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty and the child was back on the grain sacks, eyes closed, the shivering in its chest slower and more regular. Asleep, or something like it. I folded my apron, the brown canvas one, the one with the soft strings, and I set it on the grain sacks beside it. Not over it, beside it, within reach. Then I locked up the tent flap and went to my bunk. That should have been the end of it. One wet evening, a lost child under a table, a bowl of broth. The kind of small thing that happens in a camp that has been temporary for 14 years, and accumulates small things the way old canvas accumulates patches. One more, stitched in, barely visible in the overall pattern. It came back the next morning. I was on my third cauldron, the grain porridge, when I heard the tent flap move. I did not look up immediately because the tent flap moves in the plateau wind constantly, and I have learned not to track every movement. But the weight on the flap was different from wind. A sustained, deliberate weight, the kind that means a body, and I looked up and it was the child. Standing at the entrance to the tent, copper scales dark with morning damp, stub wings half raised in a posture I would eventually come to recognize as watchfulness, looking at me. I looked back. It came inside. It walked along the south wall, precise, deliberate, close to the canvas, to the space under the serving table, and it lay down on the folded apron where I had left it, and it watched me work. The morning line started at 6:30. The child did not move when the first regulars came through. It lay under the table and watched. Halfway through the line, when the cauldron was at the level where I needed to tilt it to keep the ladle filled, I set a second tin bowl of porridge on the floor and pushed it under the table without breaking the serving rhythm. I heard the small sound of snout against tin. The line kept moving. Nobody asked about it. In a camp that has been temporary for 14 years, you develop a certain incuriosity about the details of other people's arrangements. What is under someone else's table is not your business. I called it kettle, not to its face or not in any way that suggested the name was serious, but in my own head, because it had appeared near the cauldron and the sound it made was not unlike the sound of water just before it boils. A low, variable, pressured sound that could tip into urgency or subside into quiet depending on whether you paid attention to it. Kettle. It was a working name. It meant nothing. By the third day, Kettle knew the schedule. This is the thing that I found most striking in retrospect, though I did not let myself be struck by it at the time. I had told it nothing. I had not spoken to it beyond the initial look we exchanged on the first evening. I had given it no signal, made no gesture toward a timetable. And yet on the third morning, it arrived 7 minutes before I opened the tent flaps for the pre-service setup. Before the regulars, before the supply clerk with the daily allotment manifest, before anyone, and it walked to the space under the table and lay down on the folded apron and waited. And when the morning line ended and I folded the table back and began the between-service cleanup, it moved to the warmest corner of the tent by itself, out of the work area, without being asked, and lay there until I set up for dinner. It was learning me, the shape of my day. I tried on the fourth morning to think about what I should do about it. The camp has a processing desk. An intake and documentation office in the administrative tent on the north side, staffed by a rotation of civil coordinators and a pair of automated registration units with translation matrices. If there was a lost draconic child in the camp, the correct procedure was to bring it to processing, file an unaccompanied minor report, and let the system handle repatriation. The processing desk has a 6-hour average wait. I have sat in that wait exactly twice in 11 years, both times for supply disputes that could not be resolved at the gate, and both times I came away with a headache and a revised opinion of the phrase, "The system will handle it." The system at Tethara Crossing is staffed by people who are doing their best with resources that were allocated for 40,000 transit residents and are currently stretched across 63,000, and the unaccompanied minor process. I had looked it up, that fourth morning, in the camp's procedural database on the shared terminal in the staff corridor, has a documented average resolution time of 31 days for non-human cases due to the complexity of cross-species repatriation law. 31 days. In 31 days, at current population density, the child would be in a holding block in a different part of the camp with 40 other minors, eating the standard ration, with no one assigned to monitor it except the block volunteers who cycled through every 2 days. I thought about the grain sacks. I thought about the folded apron. I thought about the way it had arrived on the third morning 7 minutes before I opened the tent, which meant it had been out in the camp at night, moving through the rows to get to the right tent at the right time, which meant it was navigating by something memory smell. I didn't know, and that something was mine. I did not file an unaccompanied minor report on the fourth day. I'm not going to pretend that was a well-considered decision, or that I had thought through its implications. I want to be precise about this, because the way the story has been told since, and it has been told more than I ever intended or wanted, tends to make it sound as if I had some plan, some foreknowledge, some sense that what I was doing mattered in a way larger than the obvious. I didn't. I had a child under my table who knew my schedule and ate my soup and slept on my apron. I had a processing desk with a 6-hour wait and a 31-day resolution time. And I had 47 years of pragmatic experience, which told me that the system has never once solved a problem faster than the person closest to it. That is all it was. I am 61 years old, and I have learned not to explain myself more than the situation requires. On the 5th day, Kettle let me touch it. It was not dramatic. I was reaching under the table for one of the grain sacks. I needed it to kneel on. The pilot burner was giving trouble again, and my hand came to rest on the child's back before I realized it was there. I froze. It froze. A second passed, maybe 2, in which neither of us moved. And then I felt the small barrel chest expand against my palm in a long, slow inhalation, and the tension went out of the copper-brown scales under my hand, the way tension goes out of a muscle that has been braced for a long time and finally decides it doesn't need to be. I left my hand there for a moment. Then I retrieved the grain sack and relit the burner and went back to work. After that it was different. Not dramatically, nothing about those days was dramatic, and I am glad for that because I am too old for drama and too tired for revelations. It was different in the way that small things become comfortable, by accumulation, by the absence of disruption. On the 6th morning, it moved on its own from the grain sacks to the folded apron, to a position beside my left foot while I worked the cauldron, close enough that I could feel its warmth through my boot. And it stayed there through the entire morning line, watching the faces of the people who came through with an attention that I recognized as something more than idle curiosity. It was cataloging them, learning the shapes, the smells, the order. I wondered sometimes, in the space between the morning line and the dinner setup, what it made of us. The people who came through my line were the full catalog of species and circumstances that a transit camp on a border world collects. Human refugees from the interim resettlements, Varethi traders waiting for route clearance, Kethori laborers between contracts, a handful of species I had no name for, children of every description, old people who had been traveling longer than some people had been alive. They came through my line and I put food in their bowls and they went away. Kettle watched them all with those deep honey-gold eyes and did not react, not to the Varethi, whose amber-green scales were close to its own in color, not to the Kethori, whose ridge crest could go high and aggressive in crowded spaces, not to the human children who occasionally pressed their faces against the counter edge, trying to see the dragon child under the table, which I put a stop to by leaning over the counter and saying back in line, please, in the tone of voice that works on children of most species, because the frequency conveys the meaning independent of the language. There is a thing that happens between people, between a person and an animal, between any two creatures who share a space long enough without hostility, a kind of mutual cartography that doesn't need to be declared. By the sixth morning, I knew that Kettle did not like sudden sounds from the direction of the tent entrance, and that she watched the east-facing corner of the tent with a particular attentiveness in the late afternoon when the light changed, and that she had a way of pressing her snout briefly against the inside of my left boot when she passed it that I took, after some observation, to be a greeting rather than an accident, because she did it each time she returned to the tent, and at no other time. She knew that I would not reach for her suddenly, that the bowl would appear at regular intervals, that the pilot burner gave its particular rattle before it caught clean, and that the rattle was not a danger sound. She knew that I hummed when I was working the second cauldron and did not hum during the line, and that the stopping of the hum meant the line was about to start. She used this information. When the humming stopped on the sixth morning, she moved from the warm corner where she had been lying to the position beside my left foot before I had even moved toward the counter. I found this more interesting than I expected to. I am not by nature a person who finds small things interesting, or rather, I am a person who has learned to be competent at practical things and who has not had much occasion, in 11 years of running a camp mess line, to notice what is interesting about them. The small things of a soup line are the pilot burner, the portion level, the supply manifest, the approximate moods of 63,000 people on any given morning. These are interesting only in the way that a problem is interesting, which is to say that they absorb attention without inviting curiosity. Kettle was different. Kettle was curious about things in a way that invited me to be curious about things, which is a quality I had not encountered in a tent companion before, and which I did not entirely know what to do with. On the sixth evening, after the dinner line, I sat on the upturned supply crate I use as a stool when I'm doing the ledger entries, and I watched her. She was investigating the east corner of the tent, the one she always watched in the afternoon, moving around the base of the folded table legs with her snout close to the ground, reading something in the seam where the canvas met the packed dirt that I clearly could not read. Her stub wings flexed occasionally, not in flight intention, but in the way that a person adjusts their balance. Her tail moved in long, slow arcs behind her that I had learned to read as concentration rather than contentment. The contentment sweep was shorter and more regular. The concentration sweep was like this, slower, variable, occasionally still. She was working something out. I finished the ledger. She was still working it out when I left for the night. I left the apron on the grain sacks, same as always. In the morning it would be warm and she would be on it, and that was the shape of the sixth day. It was on the seventh day that I noticed the perimeter. I had gone out after the dinner line to take the food waste to the composting bins on the east side of the camp, which is part of my routine 3 nights a week, because the camp's waste collection is reliable in inverse proportion to how much you need it. It was close to 9 in the evening dark, the kind of dark that a camp full of electric lanterns and generator hum makes, not black, but thick and yellow-tinged, the light reaching up and scattering against the low cloud so that the sky above the camp is its own kind of dim radiance, and you can see nothing beyond the perimeter fence clearly. But clearly enough. There were shapes at the tree line. beyond the perimeter fence, where the scrubland gives way to the low gray thorn trees that run along the plateau's edge, perhaps 200 meters from the wire. Still shapes, large shapes, visible only because the cloud-scattered camp light gave just enough illumination to suggest volume where there should have been only shadow. They had not been there the night before. I was certain of that because I had made this same walk on Tuesday and the tree line had been empty. Today was Thursday. I stood at the compost bin and looked at the shapes for a long moment. They did not move. They were too far and too still, and the light was too poor to read any detail, and after a while I concluded that I was looking at the gray thorn trees themselves, possibly, their silhouettes gathered and made to seem larger by the particular quality of the light. I went back inside. I did not mention it to anyone. But I thought about it. The 8th morning I was at the cauldrons by 4 as usual. The camp was quiet at 4, the generator at lower power, the canvas town of 63,000 in its few hours of stillness. I worked in the low light of my own lamp and listened to the plateau wind on the tent fabric and thought about nothing particular, which is the particular quality of very early morning that I value above most things. Kettle came in at 4:10. Not at 7 minutes before the line, as it had done for the past 5 days. At 4:10 in the dark, while I was still building the first cauldron. It came through the tent flap with a different quality of movement than I had seen before, fast and low, hugging the south wall, not the deliberate, careful walking of the past days, but something urgent. It went straight to the apron, still folded on the grain sacks from the night before, and pressed itself against the south wall with its stub wings raised and its small body tight against the canvas, which was behavior I had not seen from it before. I put down the ladle.